Good afternoon. Welcome to this first lecture in our program on the modern novel. My name is Fouzi Slisli and I will be your instructor. So today, since this is a course on the modern novel, we're going to start by looking at general characteristics of modernism. What is modernism? Just so we can understand what the modern novel is, let's look at modernism and its characteristics. So, we begin first of all by a definition. What is modernism? According to Christ Boldick, in the concise Oxford definition of literary terms, he says modernism is a general term applied retrospectively to the wide range of experimental and avant-garde trends in the literature and other arts of the early 20th century. So what we understand from this is that modernism is a general term. It's not a specific term, it's not a precise term, it's a general term. And that it's applied retrospectively, which means that some people came, writers and authors and novelists and artists produced their art 20 years, 30 years later. Then we retrospectively started calling those artists and writers and novelists and poets, we started calling them modernists and modernism. So the title was applied retrospectively to a wide range of experimental and avant-garde trends. This is a characteristic of modernism, that it's experimental and it's avant-garde, right? It's experimental in the sense of experimenting with new styles, with new forms, with new visions, with new forms of communication, with new styles of writing. And it's avant-garde in the sense that it confronts, it does not, it confronts and discusses things that usually societies are too scared to talk about, right? They're not scared to talk about what's taboo or what's not acceptable. So it's an experimental movement, it's avant-gardist, it's a general term, and it was applied retrospectively to, literature and other arts of the early 20th century. Let's look at another definition, this time from J.A. Kadar, from the Penguin Dictionary of Literary Terms and Literary Theory, 1998. Kadar says that modernism is a movement which began in the closing years of the 19th century and which had a wide influence internationally during much of the 20th century. So we learn here that modernism began in the 19th century and it had a wide influence internationally during much of the 20th century. It reveals a breaking away from established rules, traditions, and conventions. That's very important. Modernism is about breaking away from established rules, traditions, and conventions. Modernism is about finding fresh ways of looking at man's position and function in the universe, and it's about doing as many experiments in form and style. It is particularly concerned with language and how we use it, and with writing itself. So this is the Penguin Dictionary of Literary Terms and Literary Theory. Let's take a third definition, just to be on the safe side, from Peter Childs, from a book called Modernism. He says the term modernism is not a precise label. As we said in the first definition, it's a general term. It's a general term. It's not a precise label, but instead it's a way of referring to the efforts of many individuals across the arts who tried to move away from established modes of realistic representation. One thing we should remember from here is that when you're asked to define something, rely on authorities who are authorities in the field. So we want to know what modernism is, we want a definition of modernism. we get definitions from books that are authorities in the subjects, from experts in the field, right? And try to always do that. It's always good to give a definition from an authority. And it's always good to give more than one definition. Like here we've given 3 definitions so far, because definitions, especially in human sciences, in literature, this is not medicine or math. Our definitions are not precise. So it's always good to give 2 or 3 definitions so you get a sense of, how precise, how general, or how specific these definitions and these terms are. Well, okay, let's talk a little bit about the development, the emergence and development of modernism. Why did modernism develop? Well, during the 19th century, the Enlightenment notion of the world as a machine, something whose parts could be named and seen to function, came into favor. The idea that emerged in the Enlightenment in the 18th century, that the world is like a machine and its parts could be named, and the way these parts function can be explained, right? It's what became known as natural laws, right? So the 19th century was the age of scientific rationalism, right? The idea of progress. And the 19th century also is the age of high or heavy industrialization. So the idea of progress and the world as a machine and the tendency to reduce everything in life to mathematical and scientific measurement was very fashionable in the 19th century. Positivism, this is what was known as positivism. It's the 19th century belief that everything, including human nature, could be explained and understood through science. So science is new, it has achieved industrialization, and right now science claims to be able to explain even human nature, right? Even science is claiming that everything is measurable and quantifiable. And this idea, this tendency, led to a lot of destruction. I mean, of course, a lot in human life and the human world cannot be quantified. I mean, happiness is not something you measure or quantify. Wealth is not about money. And, the beauty of the sun, the beauty of nature is not something that science can explain. There are things that we just feel, And there are truths, qana'a, for example, feeling self-sufficient. That's not something that science can explain or understand, especially experimental science, So, 19th century was the age of intense industrialization. Cities were destroyed and turned into factories, basically. The sky was polluted with factories, and the rivers and the oceans were polluted. The air is polluted. Small farmers became extinct, and we saw the emergence of big agricultural businesses. And even the human being, I mean, in Charles Dickens' novels, Hard Times, there is a sentence where one of the characters, who is a bourgeois factory owner, who believes that everything is facts and we should just teach children facts, nothing else. He says, I don't know what man is. All I know is how many hours he works and how much money he gets paid, right? So according to science and progress and scientific rationalism, what man is not important, We don't care about what man is. What we need to know is how many hours he works, how much money he gets. whether he's happy, he's satisfied, we've been fair to him, we've been just to him, he has dreams, hopes, families, relationships, all of it is insignificant, irrelevant for science, right? Well, modernism rejects this idea. Modernism rejects scientific rationalism as destructive to human societies. Modernist writings react to several changes during the first part of the 20th century. So they react to industrialization and mechanization. They react to rapid technological advances, and they reject those, right? They see humans losing their humanity. They see societies where human beings are losing their humanity and becoming robots. Science and industrialization taking over human societies. So modernist writing reject these trends and tendencies in European societies. So, and also there were important changes happened in the 20th century. First of all, there is two ugly world wars. They were very ugly world wars. World War I was the first total war, we call a total war, in which the destruction, I mean, usually armies face each other and fight, but because technological development were incorporated and used in building war machines, right? Armies now can destroy societies, not just an army. It's not one army facing another army. It's one army destroying this society and that army destroying this society. An entire country can be destroyed now by pushing few buttons. So the casualties, the destruction of the First World War and the Second World War were staggering. They were shocking. So World War I was the first total war in which weapons spared no one, including civilians. The casualties suffered by participants in World War I dwarfed those of previous wars. Some 8,500,000 soldiers died as a result of wounds and or disease. War was increasingly mechanized and industrialized from 1914 and produced casualties even when nothing important was happening. It has been estimated that the number of civilian deaths attributed to the war was higher than the military casualties, or around 13 million civilians died. These civilian deaths were largely caused by starvation, exposure, disease, military encounters, and massacres. The enormity of the war had undermined humankind's faith in Western society and culture. A generation of young men was lost. Survivors, those who survived, re-examined the basis of certainty. They had to say, stop. We need to rethink the rules and the laws and the norms with which we live. So the survivors re-examined the basis of certainty, the structure of knowledge, the systems of beliefs and authorities, creating a feeling of hopelessness. People started thinking there is no hope. Humans are doomed. Humans will destroy themselves. Post-war modernist literature reflected a sense of disillusionment and fragmentation. Disillusionment in the sense that they don't feel hopeful. They feel that the world is going to its destruction. And fragmentation in the sense that they don't feel part of a united whole community. They're fragmented. They feel isolated, lonely, alienated. Isolated, lonely, and alienated. So life is fragmented. There is a sense of fragmentation, disillusionment. Also, there was a lot of, philosophical ideas, a lot of development in philosophy and thought. For example, Karl Marx's ideas in the 19th century, his explanation of history, which is called Dialectical Materialism, which sees historical progress as the political struggle between two classes resulting in new socio-economic order. And basically, what Karl Marx said that was new is that we are wrong to look at history as developing because major event happen or a great person comes, right? History and historical development does not happen because of one event or one person. That history is a dialectical materialism. It is a continuous struggle, political struggle between two classes. In the medieval period, it was a struggle between the aristocracy and the serfs, right? And in the industrial age, in the 19th and 20th century, it's a struggle between the bourgeoisie who owns the means of production, people who own the economy, own the factories, own the capital, own the money, the banks, the finances, and then you have the workers, people who own nothing but their labor force. So it's a struggle between capital and labor, right? And that history does not move because of one single event or one single person showing up on the scene. There was also important ideas that emerged in the 19th century that also made people review and re-examine man's place in the cosmos, in the world. And among these is Darwin's view of humanity as ascended from evolutionary stages that lead back to apes and fish and so on. So the traditional idea that European societies had that human beings descended from God, especially with their idea that Jesus Christ is God, right? So the idea that man is God, was very enshrined in European societies. And when Darwin came and said, sorry, man is not God, man is not created in the image of God. Man is the product of evolutionary developments that begin with a cell in water that becomes a fish, and from a fish it became all sorts of other creatures, including the monkey and then human beings. So it shifts humanity. This idea destroyed the Europeans' conception of where human beings, the place of human beings in the world. Darwin destroyed it, and it made Europeans, see humanity's place in the world in a different way. And it was unsettling because they don't have that, they can't think that human beings are noble anymore. It's this noble creature created in the image of God. Well, there's nothing noble about them. They're the product of evolutionary process that begins with the cell in water and fish and all sorts of other animals, including the monkey, and it's, gives you the human being. Another important scientist, scholar that made a huge difference is Ferdinand de Saussure. He's a Swiss linguist who argued that language is relative, that words have no direct relationship to the concepts or objects they signify. And this was important because European societies, also under the influence of Christianity and religion, believed that language was ordained by God, that language was created by God, that grammar and syntax and rules of language were created by God. Ferdinand de Saussure destroyed this idea by showing that language is arbitrary. The relationship between words and things is determined by custom. So if we take, for example, the word table, you know, we all agree to call this a table, you know, this shape that has 4 legs and we sit and use it as a desk, or we have dinner around it. We're all agreed to call it a table. But if we came and found our grandparents and parents calling this shape with 4 legs that we use for eating, if we found them calling it a cow, we would be calling it a cow today, and we would say, hey, let's sit around the cow and have dinner, you know. I'm gonna sit here on the cow and do my homework, and by cow here we mean table. So the relationship between words and things is arbitrary. It's determined by custom, urf, araf. And these customs change, and this is why things change name too. Some things, after with historical progress, some things acquire new names. And one final philosopher that made a huge impact on the 19th and 20th century thinking, and who is also a major influence on modernism, is Friedrich Nietzsche. And Friedrich Nietzsche, especially his idea that of the death of God. When he said that God is dead, he argued for the power of the human will. He shifted cultural ideologies about religion and philosophy. So Nietzsche here, I mean, let's also be clear that he's not talking about God like, you know, the real God. You know, he's talking about the God of the church in Europe. And, you know, as every student of European history knows, that the church during the medieval and the modern period was implicated in a lot of exploitation, greed, destruction, war. So their God, the God of the church, that the church used to do so much mischief, Friedrich Nietzsche was saying that it's dead. That God, the God of the church, is dead, right? And we don't need the God that you find by going to church is gone, it's dead, right? So Nietzsche doesn't negate spirituality or even religion when it's direct between human being and the Creator. But what he is denying here is the God of the institutional Christian church, which he believes is a political construct used to defraud and exploit poor population and keep them ignorant. Final major author from the 19th century that made a huge impact on modernism is Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud stressed the unconscious, the subconscious motives and instinctual drives in human beings. We believe that we make our own choices. But what Sigmund Freud was showing is that we are conditioned socially by our environment, by our society, by our communities to choose certain choices, to make certain choices, to live in certain ways, to speak in certain ways, to think in certain ways, to read in certain ways, to see in certain ways. And in that sense, we are not agents, we are subjects, you know. And the subconscious, there is a deep subconscious which really explains who we are as individuals, rather than our choices are misleading, they are just superficial. And it's a deep subconscious that really explains who, you know, what people really are. After Freud, it's impossible to ignore psychological undercurrents of human behavior. Writers deal with subconscious motivations and employ stream of consciousness in modernism. In modernist literature, stream of consciousness technique is similar to Freud's therapeutic tactic of free association. Thank you very much for watching this lecture. I hope it's been useful, and I will see you in the next lecture. and we will be talking more about modernist principle. Thank you and goodbye.